Near midnight, beneath the white lights of a research hospital, a man lies inside one of the most powerful magnetic resonance scanners ever built. The machine surrounds him like a narrow metal tunnel. Its magnets are strong enough to reveal changes in blood flow across structures smaller than those seen by ordinary clinical scanners. Every few seconds, the room fills with a hard mechanical pulse, yet the man does not move. His hands rest beside him. His breathing remains slow. Behind a thick window, several researchers watch a screen covered with shifting lines and colored maps. The subject is not asleep. He has spent decades training attention, often for hours each day. He says he can enter a series of deep meditative absorptions, known as jhanas. To an observer, the stages look almost identical. His eyes remain closed, his face stays calm, and no dramatic movement marks the passage from one state to another. Inside, however, he reports a precise sequence. Effort gathers into stability. Pleasure rises without an external cause. Joy becomes quieter. The borders of the body soften. Thought grows faint. Eventually, even the feeling of being a person who is meditating begins to lose its usual weight. A tone sounds through the headphones. It is the signal to begin. The researchers wait while the scanner measures changes across the thalamus, the cortex, and networks linked with attention, movement, memory, emotion, and the private story of the self. Several minutes later, another signal arrives. Without opening his eyes, the meditator moves toward the next absorption. On the monitors, patterns begin to shift. For most of human history, such an event could be studied only from the inside. A teacher listened to a student's description. A monastery preserved instructions. A practitioner compared an experience with words written centuries earlier. There was no independent instrument capable of watching the brain while the mind appeared to change its own structure. Now electrical recordings, functional imaging, heart measurements, and detailed interviews are being brought together around the same ancient claim. The result seems at first like forbidden knowledge made visible. If the ordinary sense of self is produced by physical activity, perhaps the moment it weakens should leave a trace. If joy can arise without possession, praise, food, or touch, perhaps the reward system should reveal how. And if consciousness can enter stable forms that most people never experience, then the familiar waking mind may be only one arrangement among many. Yet the glowing images carry a warning. A scanner does not photograph enlightenment. It measures indirect signals and converts them into maps through layers of mathematics. The most remarkable early studies have often examined a small number of exceptional people, sometimes one person across many sessions. Repetition within a single mind can show that the changes are not random, but it cannot prove that every contemplative follows the same route. Outside the scanner, the scene is ordinary. One researcher checks timing markers. Another compares the run with an earlier session. They are not searching for a mystical glow. They are looking for consistency, whether the stage returns with a similar pattern, whether transitions happen when the practitioner says they do, and whether noise can be separated from signal. That modest question may be more revolutionary than any dramatic claim. Still, something unusual is happening in the tunnel. The meditator claims to alter the texture of consciousness at will, and the machine appears to register each passage. The researchers can see that the brain is changing. What they cannot yet see is what those changes mean. When the final tone sounds, the man opens his eyes. The maps remain on the screen like footprints from a country no instrument can enter directly. Before science can decide whether it has approached nirvana, it must first understand what that word was meant to describe. The word nirvana has traveled farther than almost any idea from the ancient contemplative world. It appears in songs, advertisements, travel writing, and casual speech. A perfect meal can be called nirvana. So can a quiet beach, a moment of pleasure, or relief after a difficult week. The word has become a bright container for whatever people imagine complete happiness should feel like. But in the traditions from which it came, the meaning is far more unsettling. Nirvana was not simply a stronger form of comfort. It was linked to the ending of the forces that keep suffering in motion, grasping, hostility, and the deep confusion that treats changing experience as a permanent self. The common image is extinguishing a flame. What disappears is not necessarily consciousness or life, but the burning demand that reality satisfy desire and protect an identity that can never remain fixed. This makes nirvana difficult to place inside a laboratory. A scientist can ask someone to focus on breathing for 10 minutes. The scientist can measure heart rate, attention, electrical rhythms, or activity in networks associated with self-related thought. But nirvana is not an exercise performed on command, nor is it merely an emotion that rises, peaks, and fades. In many traditional accounts, it is known through a transformation of understanding and conduct. The person does not simply feel different during meditation. The causes of greed, hatred, and delusion are said to have weakened or ended. To study such a claim, researchers must translate it into smaller parts. They might look for stable attention, less compulsive mind-wandering, reduced fear, weaker attachment to reward, greater compassion, or a change in the boundary between observer and world. They might examine how quickly anger passes, whether pain produces less resistance, or whether a person behaves generously when generosity carries a cost. Each measure captures something important. None captures the whole. The translation creates a quiet danger. Once an ancient idea is divided into measurable features, those features can begin to replace the original. A calm nervous system may be mistaken for freedom. A dramatic brain rhythm may be treated as a spiritual signature. A temporary loss of self may be promoted as final awakening. The machine favors events that occur at a known time, yet liberation may be visible mainly in what no longer happens. The insult that does not become hatred, the desire that does not become compulsion, the fear that does not rule the next decision. Different Buddhist schools also describe the path in different ways. Some emphasize stages of insight. Some focus on emptiness, non-duality, innate awareness, or the ending of craving. Their languages overlap without becoming identical. If science chooses one definition too quickly, it may map a narrow interpretation and announce that it has mapped the destination itself. There is another problem. Traditional language often describes freedom through negation, unborn, unbound, unconditioned, no longer driven by thirst. Science works best when something appears and can be counted. It is less comfortable when the subject is absence, especially an absence known through years of ethical mental training. This is the first reversal in the investigation. The strongest pleasure recorded in a meditator's brain might have little to do with nirvana. Bliss can be intense and still become something a person wants to repeat. Visions can feel sacred and still strengthen pride. Silence can hide avoidance. What appears extraordinary from the outside may remain another experience to which the mind becomes attached. The old teachings therefore place a harder question before the scanners. They ask not only what appears within consciousness, but what has ceased to control it. Science can measure the appearance of a state with increasing precision. Measuring the absence of bondage is far more difficult, and so the investigation turns from the meaning of nirvana to the evidence that could ever support such a claim. If no single sensation, image, or rhythm is enough, what would an enlightened brain actually prove? Imagine that a future laboratory produces the clearest brain image ever recorded during meditation. A network associated with self-referential thought grows quiet. Regions involved in attention become unusually coordinated. The body settles, fear responses decrease, and the subject reports that the boundary between self and world has vanished. The image would be important. It might also prove much less than the headline suggests. Neuroscience usually studies correlations. When an experience occurs, researchers look for biological changes that occur with it. If a pattern repeatedly accompanies deep absorption, the pattern becomes a neural correlate of that state. Yet accompaniment is not the same as explanation. The activity may help produce the experience. It may appear because the experience has already begun. It may regulate the body while another hidden process does the essential work. Or it may be one strand in a system too large to reduce to a single cause. The same difficulty appears in ordinary life. A person in love shows changes in attention, reward, memory, and stress. Those signals are real, but no colored region contains the relationship. Grief alters the brain, yet the scan does not reveal who was lost or why the loss matters. In the same way, a map of meditation cannot display wisdom as a substance, expose secret motives, or show whether kindness survives outside the laboratory. Researchers could compare long-term meditators with beginners. They could examine the thickness of certain regions, the strength of connections between networks, or the speed with which attention returns after distraction. They could test reactions to unpleasant images, financial temptation, social rejection, or physical pain. They could ask relatives and colleagues whether the practitioner has become less defensive and more reliable. Each approach would add another piece, but even a large collection of pieces would depend on how enlightenment had been defined. Meditation research carries additional complications. The word meditation covers many practices that train different abilities. Years of practice are often estimated from memory. Teachers disagree about who counts as advanced. Participants may expect improvement and unconsciously shape their reports. Experienced practitioners often differ from control groups in sleep, diet, education, community, and lifestyle. Small studies can produce striking findings that disappear when tested in larger samples. Brain imaging adds its own illusion of certainty. The final picture is not a direct photograph. Researchers select methods, compare conditions, remove noise, apply statistical thresholds, and color the surviving differences. Reasonable choices can produce different maps. A bright cluster can therefore be both scientifically meaningful and dangerously easy to overinterpret. A complete study must distinguish performance from transformation. Some people can produce states under conditions yet remain reactive in life. Others may show modest scans while living with patience and generosity. If the method rewards spectacle, it could overlook quieter evidence that traditions considered more important. This does not make the investigation hopeless. It makes the rules clearer. A convincing science of liberation would need repeated results across practitioners, traditions, laboratories, and methods. It would need to separate temporary experiences from lasting changes. It would need careful reports from the meditators and evidence from their behavior. It would need to publish failures, monitor harm, and resist the temptation to turn every unusual signal into proof. Most of all, it would need humility. The brain may be necessary for every human experience, but knowing the machinery does not automatically reveal the meaning of what the machinery supports. A violin can be examined down to its wood, strings, and vibrations, yet the examination alone does not explain why one melody changes a life. The scientists behind the glass understand this problem. They do not truly see Nirvana on their monitors. They see blood flow, timing, connectivity, and patterns that may correspond with parts of a path. The mystery becomes stronger, not weaker, because the limits are visible. To continue, the investigation must leave the modern scanner for a while. Long before laboratories measured the mind, wandering seekers built another kind of map from breath, sensation, desire, fear, and attention. Their instruments were imperfect and private, but their experiment lasted for generations. In the darkness before brain science, they began asking whether the person inside experience was as solid as it appeared. Before laboratories filled with magnets and screens, another investigation began beneath a warmer sky. At dawn in ancient South Asia, city gates opened, merchants arranged cloth and grain, rulers collected taxes, families lit household fires, and travelers moved along roads between growing kingdoms. The world was changing. Wealth gathered in new centers. Ideas crossed borders. Old rituals remained powerful, yet many people were beginning to ask whether inherited answers could explain the private unease that followed them through every success. Among them were wanderers who stepped outside ordinary life. Some slept beneath trees, some fasted, some trained the body through pain. Others sat quietly and watched the mind. They were not united by one doctrine, but by a suspicion that suffering could not be explained only by bad fortune. A person might obtain what he wanted and still fear losing it. He might avoid one danger and immediately imagine another. Pleasure arrived, faded, and left behind a new desire. Even victory carried the shadow of change. The radical proposal was that distress is shaped not only by events, but by the mind's relationship to events. A sound appears, and the mind names it pleasant or irritating. A memory returns, and the body reacts as though the past has entered the room. A stranger's expression is interpreted as respect, threat, or rejection. Before the person notices what has happened, desire or resistance has already begun. The ancient investigators did not speak of predictive models or neural networks. They spoke in the language available to them: craving, aversion, ignorance, impermanence, and the chain by which one reaction gives birth to another. Yet their method contained something surprisingly familiar. They observed repeated patterns. They tested instructions through practice. They compared reports with teachers and communities. They asked whether certain forms of attention produced reliable changes. Their questions were practical, because suffering was practical. Age altered every body. Illness ignored rank. Death entered rich homes and poor huts alike. Love created tenderness, but also fear of separation. The seekers were not solving a distant puzzle. They were examining why the mind turned change into torment, and whether careful attention could reveal the turning point before reaction hardened into fate in daily life itself. Their laboratory was the body sitting in heat, dust, rain, hunger, and silence. Breath became a clock. Sensation became evidence. Thought was no longer treated only as truth, but as an event that could be watched. A desire appeared, reached a peak, and vanished. Anger changed the chest and face before it became a story. The feeling of I seemed strongest when something had to be defended, possessed, or remembered. This did not make the early traditions modern science in disguise. Their aims, assumptions, and standards were different. They were searching for liberation, not publishing neutral descriptions. Their communities carried myths, rituals, social rules, and disagreements. Still, they developed an unusual discipline. They turned attention inward, with the patience normally reserved for stars, seasons, medicines, or trade. Over generations, a disturbing possibility emerged. The self that felt continuous might be assembled from changing parts: bodily sensations, memories, intentions, perceptions, and habits of recognition. None remained fixed, yet together they created the impression of an owner standing behind experience. The mind protected that owner, compared it with others, and suffered whenever the world refused to confirm its story. Long before a scanner displayed a default mode network, these observers were asking whether identity was a process pretending to be a thing. If they were right, freedom would not require building a better permanent self. It might require seeing why permanence had been imagined at all. But observation alone was not enough. Different teachers developed different ways of training the mind, and the silence of meditation concealed a surprising variety of inner actions. To understand the old map, the next step is to discover how many practices have been hidden beneath one simple word. From the outside, meditation can look almost empty. A person sits, closes the eyes, and becomes still. To the casual observer, one silent figure resembles another. Inside, however, the mind may be performing tasks as different as holding a candle flame steady, opening every window in a house, or questioning whether the house has an owner. In focused attention practice, awareness is placed on a chosen object. It may be the breath, a sensation in the hands, a sound, an image, or a repeated phrase. The object is not important because it is magical. It becomes a stable point against which wandering can be recognized. Attention leaves, the practitioner notices, and attention returns. The movement seems small, but it exposes how rarely the mind remains where it intends to be. Open monitoring practice changes the task. Instead of protecting one object from distraction, the meditator allows sounds, sensations, thoughts, and emotions to arise within a wider field. Nothing needs to be held for long. The training lies in seeing each event without immediately chasing it, pushing it away, or turning it into identity. A thought about failure becomes a thought rather than a verdict. An itch becomes changing pressure rather than an order that must be obeyed. Compassion and loving-kindness practices work differently again. They deliberately bring certain people to mind and cultivate goodwill toward them. At first, the feeling may seem artificial. Over time, the practitioner studies the barriers that decide who deserves warmth and who remains outside it. The practice is not emotional decoration. It trains attention, imagination, bodily feeling, and the willingness to remain near suffering. Insight practices may examine change itself. The meditator watches how every sensation forms and disappears, how ownership is added after experience arises, or how the observer cannot be found apart from observing. Absorption practices gather the mind into increasingly unified states where ordinary sensory concerns and inner speech may become faint. Non-directive practices may allow spontaneous thought to move more freely, observing rather than narrowing it. The body also participates differently in each method. Focus may slow movement and narrow sensory priorities. Compassion can awaken warmth, sadness, or protective energy. Insight may make familiar sensations feel less personal. Absorption can reduce awareness of the room almost completely. A scanner that ignores these distinctions may combine unlike events, average away their important features, and produce a result that belongs to no actual practice. The still posture conceals not emptiness, but a crowded landscape of choices, unfolding beneath the calm of the body. These methods should not be expected to produce one universal brain pattern. One strengthens deliberate control, another relaxes control while preserving clarity. One increases emotional warmth. Another investigates how emotions are built. Even similar names can hide different instructions across teachers and traditions. This is why the phrase, meditation changes the brain, can mislead. It resembles saying that sport changes the body without distinguishing swimming from weightlifting, sprinting from archery, or recovery from competition. The statement may be true, yet too broad to explain anything important. Neuroimaging reviews reflect this variety. Different practices recruit partly different systems, and even activity associated with self-related thought does not move in the same direction under every technique. A method that permits free mental movement may not resemble one that repeatedly interrupts wandering. Silence is not a single neurological condition. For beginners, this variety offers relief. Distraction does not always mean failure, and effort is not always the goal. A practice must be judged by what it is designed to train. Two people can sit beside each other with closed eyes, while one narrows attention to a single breath, and the other releases every attempt to choose. Yet a deeper confusion remains. Any of these methods can produce a powerful moment: peace, unity, clarity, or joy. The moment may feel final while it is present. Then the bell rings, the body moves, and old reactions return. The ancient traditions therefore drew a line that modern research must also confront, the line between a state that happens and a trait that has changed. A remarkable experience can feel like a new life. During retreat, a person may sense that the body has disappeared, that time has stopped, or that every boundary has opened into one field. Fear may vanish for an hour. Thought may become transparent. The event can remain vivid for decades and divide memory into a before and an after. Yet a state is not the same as a trait. A state is a temporary arrangement. It appears under certain conditions and fades when those conditions change. A trait is a more lasting tendency in perception, emotion, or behavior. The distinction seems simple, but it quietly overturns many popular claims about awakening. A temporary state can be compared with a path across fresh snow. For a while, the route is clear. A person knows where the feet have traveled. Then wind moves across the field, and the surface closes again. Repeated walking may deepen the track, making the route easier to find. Eventually, the landscape itself may be altered. Practice, in this image, is not one perfect crossing. It is the gradual shaping of what the mind does without being forced. Neuroscience tries to separate these levels. Researchers measure the brain while someone meditates, then compare that activity with resting states before and after practice. They examine whether long-term practitioners differ from beginners when no meditation is occurring. They test attention, emotional recovery, pain, reward, and responses to social stress. Structural scans look for differences associated with years of training, although such differences cannot easily prove what caused them. Time matters as well. A calm response measured 1 week after a retreat may fade months later. A subtle change may deepen only after years. Some benefits appear quickly because participants expect them. Others emerge slowly through habits that are difficult to notice. The stronger the claim, the longer and more ordinary the observation must become across the seasons of life. Traditional frameworks apply an even harder test. Insight must change conduct. A person who experiences boundless unity but continues to deceive, exploit, or rage has not demonstrated freedom merely because the inner event was intense. Ethical restraint, generosity, patience, and reduced grasping are not polite additions placed beside meditation. They are evidence that understanding has entered the machinery of daily choice. This creates an uncomfortable problem for any science of enlightenment. Laboratories are designed to isolate variables. Ordinary life refuses isolation. The practitioner is calm in a quiet room, but what happens during public humiliation? The scanner shows reduced threat activity, but what happens when status, money, desire, or loyalty is tested. A questionnaire reports compassion, but how do family members experience the person during exhaustion and conflict? Some changes may also be hidden from dramatic measurement. Freedom might appear not as a powerful new response, but as the absence of an old one. An insult does not continue through the night. A desire is felt without becoming a command. Pain arrives without the added belief that it should not exist. These missing reactions are difficult to photograph, yet they may matter more than spectacular states. The audience has reason to be skeptical. History contains teachers who spoke of transcendence while protecting power. Modern culture rewards spiritual identity, public certainty, and impressive language. A person may become attached to being detached, proud of humility, or dependent on memories of a peak experience. The ego can rebuild itself from the story of having escaped ego. The true test may therefore begin after meditation ends and another person becomes difficult. If training has become a trait, it should influence the space between irritation and action, fear and decision, pleasure and possession. It should survive noise, fatigue, disappointment, and the return of ordinary responsibilities. To understand how such a transformation might occur, the investigation must turn toward the system that keeps rebuilding identity from moment to moment. The ancient traditions called it clinging, becoming, or the illusion of self. Modern neuroscience approaches it through networks that remember the past, imagine the future, and quietly narrate the person called me. Late at night, when the room is quiet and the body is ready for sleep, the mind often becomes louder. It replays a sentence spoken years ago. It imagines a future conversation that may never happen. It measures the present against another person's life, edits old mistakes, and rehearses dangers without being asked. Nothing is occurring in the room, yet an entire world is being built behind closed eyes. Neuroscientists associate much of this inward movement with a set of connected regions called the default mode network. The name can sound as though it describes an idle brain, but the network is anything but inactive. It helps assemble autobiographical memory, imagine possible futures, interpret other people, and maintain the story of a continuous person moving through time. Several important areas participate. The medial prefrontal cortex is often involved when information is related to oneself. The posterior cingulate cortex and precuneus contribute to internal awareness, memory, and shifting perspectives. Temporal and parietal regions help connect social knowledge, scenes, and personal meaning. Together they do not create a tiny person inside the skull. They support processes from which the familiar feeling of my life can emerge. The network also becomes active during social imagination. It helps a person infer what someone else may be thinking, remember shared history, and picture how an action will be judged. This means the machinery of self is tied to the machinery of relationship. The private narrator is partly built from imagined audiences, old approval, feared rejection, and the silent presence of people who are not in the room each night. This system is useful. Without it, planning would become difficult. A person could not easily learn from the past, anticipate another person's reaction, or maintain promises across time. The problem is not that the brain tells a story. The problem begins when the story becomes so constant that it is mistaken for the whole of reality. Rumination shows what happens when the narrator stops serving and begins ruling. A painful memory returns, then recruits explanation. Explanation becomes judgment. Judgment produces another memory, and the circle tightens. The body reacts to each imagined scene as though the event were still unfolding. The person lies safely in bed, while the nervous system prepares for a battle created from language and recollection. Meditation studies have often found reduced activity in central default mode regions during certain practices, especially when experienced meditators are compared with less trained participants. Other studies report altered communication between default mode areas and networks involved in attention and control. These results fit the possibility that thought is becoming less automatic or easier to notice before it captures awareness. But the popular phrase, switching off the ego, goes too far. The default mode network does not equal ego, and meditation does not permanently disable it. Practitioners still remember their names, recognize family members, plan journeys, and understand personal history. The change may be subtler. The narrator continues speaking, but its words are heard as constructions rather than commands. This distinction matters because silence is not the only form of freedom. A mind could become blank through injury, exhaustion, or sedation. Liberation would require clarity, not mere absence. The goal may be flexible use of self-related thought, remembering when memory is useful, planning when planning is needed, and releasing the story when it becomes unnecessary suffering. The voice called me may therefore be less like a single ruler and more like a broadcast produced by many systems. It joins fragments into a convincing account, then places ownership over what appears. Most of the time, the process is invisible because the story arrives already labeled as truth. Meditation begins to expose the broadcast. A thought appears. Awareness recognizes that it appeared. For a brief moment, the narrator is no longer alone with the microphone. Yet another system must detect that wandering has occurred, and another must guide attention back. The self-story is only one participant at the gate of consciousness. Consider a single breath. Cool air touches the nostrils, pressure shifts in the chest, and the abdomen moves. For several seconds, attention remains with these simple sensations. Then a memory appears, an unfinished message, a face, a problem waiting for morning. The breath fades from awareness even though it continues. A moment later, something recognizes that the mind has wandered. Attention returns. This small cycle involves more than one network. The default mode network helps construct the memory and its personal meaning. The salience network, which includes regions such as the anterior insular and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, helps determine what deserves priority. Executive control systems support intention, working memory, inhibition, and the deliberate movement of attention. Consciousness changes as these systems cooperate and compete. The salience network is especially important because the brain cannot treat everything as equally urgent. It must select. A sudden pain, an angry voice, an internal sensation, or a meaningful thought can rise above the background. During meditation, the moment of realizing the mind has wandered is itself a change in salience. The breath becomes important again, while the memory loses its temporary command. There is also a bodily side to the gate. The anterior insula tracks internal signals such as heartbeat, breath, tension, and discomfort. A thought becomes urgent, partly because the body changes with it. Meditation can make these signals more visible before they become a complete emotion. Tightness appears, heat rises, and the mind has a brief chance to observe the beginning of anger before anger claims the entire scene. That interval may be one of training's most practical effects. It does not remove feeling. It reveals the small sequence through which feeling becomes urgency, story, and action before the choice seems already made. Executive networks then help restore the chosen task. At first, the process may feel forceful. The beginner drags attention back, grows frustrated, and repeats the effort. With practice, recognition can become quicker and return less violent. The mind does not need to punish itself for wandering. It only needs to see what happened clearly enough to choose again. This is why meditation may not work by silencing one region. It may train timing. It may change how quickly distraction is detected, how strongly emotional material captures attention, and how smoothly control is released once it is no longer needed. Freedom, in this view, is not a frozen brain state. It is the capacity to move among states without being trapped inside one. Some studies suggest experienced meditators show altered connectivity between default mode and control regions. The finding can sound contradictory. Why would a practice associated with less self-related thought strengthen connections involving the self-related network? One possibility is that improved communication allows internal activity to be noticed and regulated, rather than merely suppressed. A well-connected narrator may be easier to interrupt than one speaking in isolation. The metaphor of a gate helps. Memories, sensations, threats, goals, and fantasies arrive continuously. Salient systems help decide which visitor receives attention. Control systems maintain or redirect the choice. Default mode systems bring personal history and imagined futures. Meditation does not empty the road. It changes who controls the gate and how quickly the gate can reopen. This model also explains why different practices create different patterns. Focused attention repeatedly favors one object. Open monitoring keeps the gate wide while reducing grasping. Compassion training increases the importance of another person's suffering without allowing distress to dominate. Insight practice questions the assumption that every visitor belongs to a permanent owner. Perhaps freedom does not require destroying the inner narrator. It may require preventing any network from holding the microphone forever. A thought can speak, a sensation can answer, and awareness can remain larger than the argument. Yet network switching still leaves a deeper mystery. Why does the brain create such a convincing owner in the first place? Why do predictions, memories, and bodily signals gather around one point called me? To approach that question, the investigation must descend beneath narration into the machinery of expectation. The world seems to arrive complete. A cup appears as a cup. A familiar face is recognized before its details are examined. A sound in the dark becomes a closing door, a footstep, or the wind. Experience feels as though the senses deliver reality directly to consciousness. The brain, however, does not wait passively for a finished world. It continually predicts what is likely to be present. Incoming signals are compared with memory, context, bodily need, and expectation. When the prediction fits, perception becomes fast and effortless. When it fails, the error demands attention, and the model is updated. This process can be seen in simple moments. A person waiting for an important message feels a vibration that never occurred. A coat hanging in darkness briefly becomes a human figure. A sentence with a missing letter is read correctly because the mind supplies what should be there. Perception is neither pure invention nor perfect recording. It is a controlled meeting between signal and expectation. Predictions also protect energy. The brain cannot rebuild every interpretation from nothing. It relies on shortcuts learned through culture, family, danger, success, and repetition. Those shortcuts make life possible, but they can preserve old fear after circumstances change. A nervous system may continue predicting threat in a safe room because yesterday's model still arrives faster than today's evidence, shaping what the person notices, avoids, remembers, and expects to happen next. Within this framework, the self may be one of the brain's most useful predictions. It organizes which body is mine, which memories belong together, which goals should continue tomorrow, and which dangers threaten this particular life. The model creates stability across constant change. It allows a person to act as though yesterday's promises and tomorrow's consequences belong to the same being. Suffering may increase when the model becomes rigid. A passing sadness is interpreted as, "I am broken." Uncertainty becomes, "I am unsafe." Another person's success becomes evidence that, "I am behind." The prediction shapes attention, and attention gathers confirming evidence. Soon the story feels discovered rather than constructed. Meditative training may loosen confidence in some of these predictions. When attention rests closely with sensation, the body is experienced as pressure, warmth, vibration, movement, and space, rather than a single solid object. When thoughts are observed, ownership may appear after the thought rather than before it. The sentence arises, and only then does the mind claim, "I thought this." Some contemporary theories describe deconstructive meditation as a change in the weight given to habitual models. Predictions are not destroyed, their authority becomes more flexible. Immediate sensory information can be experienced without being forced so quickly into familiar categories. The practitioner discovers that identity is useful, but not always necessary for awareness to continue. This remains a theory, not a final explanation. Predictive processing is a broad framework, and it can be stretched too easily over every mystery. Researchers still debate how specific contemplative experiences should be understood within it. Yet the framework creates a striking bridge with ancient observations. Both suggest that what feels permanent may be repeatedly assembled, and what feels obvious may depend on habits of interpretation. The deepest implication is not that the self is unreal in the sense of being meaningless. A map is not a landscape, but it remains useful. A self-model can guide responsibility, relationship, and survival without existing as an unchanging object. The error begins when the map demands that every experience protect its borders. The ordinary self may feel solid because the prediction succeeds so often that the construction disappears. Meditation makes the seams easier to notice. Sensation appears before the label. Thought appears before ownership. Reaction begins before the story explaining it. If these processes are trained repeatedly, the brain may learn that another response is possible. But theories of prediction must meet the practical reality of practice. One wandering breath, one recognition, and one return. The next chapter follows that smallest repetition to see how a habit of attention might become a different way of living. A beginner sits in a quiet room and decides to follow 10 breaths. The first breath is clear. During the second, a distant sound enters awareness. By the third, the mind has begun planning tomorrow. Several moments pass before the beginner remembers the practice and returns, disappointed that something so simple has already failed. But the failure contains the training. Attention rests on the breath. It wanders. Wandering is recognized. The distraction is released. Attention returns. These 5 movements form a small cycle that may repeat hundreds of times in one session. The beginner imagines that meditation should eliminate the cycle. In reality, recognizing it may be the precise moment when a new capacity is being strengthened. The smallest victory is easy to miss. The practitioner may spend most of a session distracted and still experience one instant in which a thought is seen before it becomes another thought. That instant cannot be stored, but it can be repeated. Over time, the mind becomes familiar with the route back. The return stops feeling like defeat and begins to feel like remembering something that was always available beneath the noise. The practice advances through these quiet recoveries, not through perfect control, dramatic experience, or any spiritual performance whatever. At first, each return requires effort. The intention to meditate must be remembered while thoughts compete for priority. The practitioner may tighten the face, hold the breath, or treat attention like an animal that must be forced into place. This effort often creates another layer of difficulty. Frustration becomes the new distraction, followed by judgment about being unable to control the mind. A skilled teacher changes the instruction. The return should be clear but gentle. Wandering is not a moral failure. It is what an untrained system does when memories, goals, and emotions become salient. The important event is not that attention left, it is that awareness eventually noticed. Neuroscience divides the cycle into recognizable phases. During mind wandering, internally directed networks become active. The moment of awareness recruits systems linked with salience and conflict monitoring. Deliberate redirection engages control regions. Sustained attention then stabilizes the chosen object, at least until the next departure. Repeated practice may change the timing between these phases. Distraction is noticed sooner. The story captures less energy. Return requires less force. What once consumed 10 minutes becomes visible within seconds. The practitioner does not necessarily have fewer thoughts. Thoughts may simply lose the ability to remain invisible while controlling attention. Experience also changes the cost of concentration. Intermediate practitioners sometimes show strong engagement of control systems because they have learned to apply effort effectively. Very advanced practitioners may show less activation during the same task. This does not mean their attention is weaker. The process may have become more efficient, like a musician whose hands no longer struggle to find familiar notes. Here the expected picture reverses. Mastery may not appear as maximum brain activity. It may appear as reduced correction, because the mind wanders less often, or returns without conflict. Effort performs an important role, then becomes an obstacle when it is no longer needed. The lesson reaches beyond meditation. A person cannot always prevent worry, anger, or desire from appearing. But recognition can interrupt the belief that appearance must become action. Each return rehearses a quiet freedom, the capacity to notice where the mind has gone, and choose where it will rest next. Over months, the breath becomes less important than the skill built around it. The practitioner is learning the texture of capture and release. A memory pulls, the body tightens, awareness opens, the grip weakens. Nothing supernatural occurs, yet the sequence may slowly reshape the future. Focused attention teaches the mind to come back to one place. The next practice asks something stranger. It removes the protected center and invites awareness to remain open, while every sound, sensation, and thought arrives on its own. The breath is still present, but it is no longer the only object. A bird calls outside. Pressure gathers in one knee. A sentence appears, followed by an image, then a faint feeling of unease without a clear cause. In open monitoring, the meditator does not choose one event and defend it against the others. Awareness widens and allows the field to change. At first, this can feel less peaceful than concentration. Narrow focus may hide how much activity is moving beneath the surface. Once the gate opens, unfinished conversations, bodily discomfort, desire, boredom, and old emotion become easier to see. The practice is not to solve each appearance. It is to observe how quickly the mind adds pursuit, resistance, and ownership. The widening of awareness can also change the sense of time. When attention is lost in thought, minutes disappear inside a private story. When experience is observed directly, a second contains many small events: pressure shifting, sound fading, breath turning, an image forming, a mood changing. Nothing needs to be slowed by force. The mind simply notices the detail that habit normally compresses. This richness can feel spacious, even when the room and body remain exactly where they were. The practitioner discovers that ordinary consciousness was never truly empty. It was overflowing with events too brief and familiar to be noticed clearly before in ordinary life. A thought such as, "something is wrong with me," usually arrives as meaning. The words are fused with memory and bodily feeling, so the thought seems to describe reality. Under careful observation, its construction becomes visible. There is a phrase in the mind, tightness in the chest, an image of the future, and a pull toward further explanation. Each element changes. The solid verdict breaks into events. Psychologists sometimes call this decentering. The person is not denying the thought or replacing it with a cheerful sentence. The relationship changes. A thought can contain useful information without becoming an unquestioned command. Sadness can be felt without turning into a permanent identity. Fear can signal possible danger without proving that danger is present. Open monitoring also reveals how emotion forms before it receives a name. Heat appears in the face. The stomach contracts. Attention narrows around an imagined offense. Only later does the mind announce, "I am angry." By noticing earlier links, the practitioner gains a small interval before the emotion organizes speech and action. The interval is not cold detachment. Sensation may become more vivid because less energy is spent escaping it. Pain is felt as pulsing, pressure, movement, and resistance. Pleasant experience is enjoyed without being held so tightly. Sounds arrive and vanish without needing a listener to possess them. Different open practices use different instructions. Some emphasize bare observation. Others allow spontaneous thought and creativity. Some examine impermanence or the absence of ownership. Their brain patterns should not be forced into one category. A non-directive method that welcomes wandering may engage internal networks differently from a method that notes and releases every thought. The common thread is flexibility rather than blankness. The mind learns that experience can change without constant intervention. Not every sound requires judgment. Not every emotion requires a story. Not every thought needs another thought to complete it. This can be useful for people trapped in overthinking, but the practice is not a quick method for erasing anxiety. Opening awareness may initially reveal more discomfort. Without support, a person may feel flooded rather than free. Skill lies in balancing clarity with stability, neither suppressing experience nor becoming lost inside it. A thought loses part of its power when it is recognized as an event. Thousands of such recognitions may gradually weaken old habits of reaction. Yet a temporary moment of distance does not prove that the brain has been permanently changed. To examine that possibility, the investigation must move from immediate experience to the slower language of neuroplasticity. The phrase, "meditation changes the brain," is repeated so often that it can sound like a miracle. Images show colored regions growing brighter. Articles describe thicker tissue, stronger connections, and emotional centers becoming smaller. The message is simple. Sit quietly for several weeks, and the brain will rebuild itself. The biological truth is more ordinary and more interesting. The brain changes continuously. Learning a language alters networks. Physical exercise affects blood flow and growth factors. Stress, sleep, illness, parenthood, loneliness, music, and repeated work all leave measurable traces. Meditation belongs within this larger principle of plasticity. The question is not whether experience changes the brain, but which changes are reliable, what produces them, and whether they improve life. Longitudinal studies have reported shifts in functional connectivity and gray matter concentration after structured mindfulness programs. Cross-sectional studies have found differences between long-term practitioners and control groups in regions involved in attention, memory, interoception, emotion, and self-related processing. The hippocampus, insula, anterior cingulate, and prefrontal systems frequently appear in these discussions. These findings are promising, but the image of a mental muscle becoming visibly stronger is misleading. Structural scans estimate properties of tissue through indirect measurements. A change may reflect many biological processes, and small differences can be influenced by hydration, sleep, motion, scanner settings, and analysis choices. When a study finds thicker cortex in experienced meditators, it does not reveal wisdom growing in a particular location. Cause is another problem. Long-term practitioners were not randomly assigned to meditate for 20 years. They may differ in education, diet, personality, income, community, stress, or health. Perhaps meditation contributed to the measured pattern. Perhaps people with that pattern were more likely to continue meditation. Perhaps both are shaped by a third factor. Short training studies offer stronger control, but they face their own difficulties. Participants know whether they are meditating. They may expect calm and report what they believe researchers want. An active comparison group must receive an equally convincing program, equal social contact, and similar expectations. Otherwise, improvement may reflect support and hope rather than the specific practice. The strongest research therefore asks several questions at once. Did the brain measure change? Did attention or emotion change with it? Did the effect last after training ended? Was the improvement greater than an equally engaging comparison program? And did the result appear again in another laboratory? A single positive answer is interesting. A pattern of answers begins to support a real mechanism. There is also the problem of scale. A statistically detectable change may be too small to matter in daily life. A meaningful improvement may occur without a dramatic scan. Human variation can be larger than the average difference between groups. The brain is not a scoreboard where one number declares who is calmer, kinder, or more awake. Good science keeps the size of a result beside its meaning, refusing to let images make modest evidence look enormous. The dramatic headline usually arrives after these details disappear. A modest association becomes proof that meditation rewires the brain. A small regional difference becomes a permanent transformation. An 8-week course becomes a shortcut to traits that traditional practitioners spent years cultivating. The correction should not erase the discovery. Repeated mental training can influence attention and emotion. Some neural changes appear consistent with improved regulation, sensory awareness, and reduced automatic self-focus. The evidence becomes stronger when multiple methods agree, changes predict behavior, and findings survive replication. But plasticity is morally neutral. Fear can reshape the brain. Addiction is plasticity. Persistent anger strengthens habits as surely as compassion training can. Change alone does not reveal whether the change is healthy, wise, or liberating. Meditation can alter the brain, but so can falling in love, losing sleep, practicing a skill, and living through danger. The important mystery is not whether tissue responds. It is whether repeated awareness creates greater freedom when conditions become difficult. Attention training offers one possible mechanism. Decentering offers another. Together they prepare the investigation for experiences far stranger than improved focus. Moments when the division between the observer and the observed appears to dissolve. The next chapter enters that borderless territory, where the self does not merely become quiet, but becomes difficult to locate at all. A bell sounds somewhere beyond the meditation hall. Normally, the mind would place the sound at a distance and feel itself listening from inside the head. In this moment, that division is missing. There is sound, clear and complete, but no separate listener can be found behind it. The room remains visible. The body continues breathing. Thoughts still appear, yet experience no longer seems arranged around a central owner. Advanced practitioners describe such moments in different ways. Some say awareness becomes open and centerless. Some speak of emptiness, unity, pure knowing, or the collapse of subject and object. Others avoid grand language and say only that seeing occurs without the extra feeling of someone standing apart from what is seen. The term non-dual awareness is often used in contemporary research, but it does not belong to one single tradition. Different schools explain the experience through different philosophies. In some, the practitioner recognizes awareness as already present before thought divides the world. In others, the experience reveals that all things arise through conditions and possess no separate essence. The descriptions overlap, yet they should not be flattened into one claim. The reports also challenge ordinary grammar. Language divides every event into a subject, an action, and an object. Someone hears something. Someone knows something. When practitioners try to describe awareness without a center, speech quietly rebuilds the division they say was absent. The account may therefore sound vague, not because nothing occurred, but because the structure of a sentence restores the owner that experience had briefly lost. This difficulty sits at the heart of every scientific interview. What makes the state scientifically interesting is that consciousness remains vivid. The practitioner is not unconscious, asleep, or sedated. Information continues to arrive. Memory may remain available. The person can sometimes respond when signaled. What weakens is the familiar structure that places an observer on one side and the observed world on the other. Ordinary perception hides how much work is required to maintain this structure. The brain combines vision, touch, balance, memory, and bodily signals into a stable point of view. It marks one body as mine, places objects at distances from it, and links thoughts to an inner speaker. The result feels so natural that its construction is almost impossible to notice. During non-dual reports, this organization may become less rigid. A sound does not cross a border to reach awareness. It appears within awareness. A sensation in the hand is not clearly more inside than the wind against the face is outside. Thoughts arise like other events, without carrying a special stamp of ownership. For some practitioners, the experience is peaceful because the burden of defending a center falls away. For others, the first opening can be disorienting. The self was not only a prison, it was also a familiar map. When the map loosens, clarity depends on preparation, stability, and interpretation. Researchers have begun using EEG, functional imaging, interviews, and carefully timed reports to examine these events. They ask whether the transition corresponds with changes in default mode activity, attention, bodily awareness, or communication between networks normally associated with internal and external processing. The evidence remains limited because the state is difficult to define and even harder to produce reliably inside a scanner. Still, the reports create a question that neuroscience cannot easily ignore. If experience continues when the central owner becomes faint, then the sense of self may be an added organization rather than the necessary container of consciousness. What remains is not nothing. The bell still sounds, breath continues, light crosses the room. The mystery lies in the absence of the one who usually claims them. But if the self becomes quiet, what happens to the brain systems that normally support its story? The obvious answer would be shut down. The emerging evidence points towards something more complicated, not the disappearance of activity, but a different relationship among the parts. The scanner invites a simple picture. During ordinary thought, the brain's self-related network glows. During selfless awareness, the glow fades. The ego switches off, and enlightenment appears as darkness in one familiar region. Reality does not seem to follow such a clean design. The default mode network participates in self-reference, memory, imagination, and social understanding. But it is not a single ego switch. During meditation, some parts may decrease their activity, while communication with other systems changes. In certain non-dual reports, the important event may be a loosening of opposition rather than the silence of one network. Ordinary waking life often alternates between inward and outward attention. A person becomes absorbed in memory, then notices the street. The eyes follow another person, then thought returns to private concerns. Brain systems associated with internal narrative and systems associated with external tasks can behave like competing teams, each becoming stronger when the other recedes. Non-dual awareness may alter that competition. Internal sensation, external sound, thought, and perception are no longer organized as belonging to separate worlds. If the experience is genuine, the brain may show unusual coordination between systems that ordinarily take turns dominating. The change would not be less consciousness, but less division in how consciousness is arranged. Some studies have reported altered connectivity during non-dual practices and changes in electrical rhythms around self-reported events. Slow frequencies, attention-related patterns, and relationships between default mode and task-positive systems have all drawn interest. Yet the findings are preliminary. Practices differ, samples are small, and timing a private transition remains difficult. One useful clue may lie in flexibility. A healthy system can move between self-related planning, direct perception, social response, and quiet awareness as circumstances require. A disturbed system may become trapped, fragmented, or unable to restore ordinary boundaries. The same reduction in self-focus could therefore have different meanings, depending on whether the brain can reorganize afterward. Researchers also distinguish the content of consciousness from its structure. A person can have ordinary thoughts while the sense of owning them changes. Another can have extraordinary visions while the owner remains intensely present. Non-duality concerns the relationship between knower and known, not simply unusual content. This distinction helps explain why spectacular imagery may be less relevant than an almost invisible change in perspective. The quieter the shift appears from outside, the more carefully scientists must connect timing, report, behavior, and measurement across sessions. The temptation to declare a signature is powerful. A distinctive pattern promises a direct test. Researchers could scan a teacher, compare the image with a standard, and announce whether non-duality was present. But brain rhythms are not unique labels. The same frequency can participate in many tasks, and similar reports can arise from different mechanisms. The more careful possibility is dynamic. Self-transcendence may involve changes in hierarchy. Signals that usually serve the self model may continue, but no longer receive automatic priority. The brain keeps processing memory, sensation, and action, while reducing the dominance of the perspective that owns them. This would explain why practitioners can function during the state. They do not lose language, perception, or the ability to move. What changes is the organization of experience around a central narrator. The orchestra continues, but the conductor is no longer imagined as separate from the music. A neural blackout would be easier to measure. Integration is harder because it depends on timing and relationship. Researchers must examine which systems communicate, how quickly patterns shift, and whether the arrangement repeats when the practitioner reports the same experience. The strongest reveal is therefore the opposite of the popular image. When separation disappears, the brain may not become empty. It may become more broadly coordinated, or coordinated without placing one model at the top. Yet this possibility creates a serious problem. Reduced boundaries also appear in dissociation, psychosis, neurological illness, sleep, and drug-induced states. A scanner may show that the ordinary self has changed without revealing whether the change is clear, healing, frightening, or dangerous. The investigation must now compare experiences that sound similar in language but lead to very different lives. A meditator says the self dissolved into a field of clear awareness. A patient says the body no longer feels real. A person under a psychedelic substance reports unity with the universe. Someone entering psychosis becomes uncertain whether private thoughts are coming from outside. In each account, the ordinary boundary of self has weakened. The similarity is real, but it may conceal more than it reveals. Dissociation often carries distance, numbness, or unreality. The person may feel separated from the body, emotions, or surroundings. The loss of ownership is not liberating because it reduces connection and control. Non-dual awareness, by contrast, is often described as unusually intimate. Experience is not far away. It is immediate, vivid, and unobstructed by a separate observer. Psychosis introduces another distinction. Boundaries between internal and external events may become unstable, but metacognitive clarity is often reduced. A thought can be treated as an external voice. Meaning expands without reliable testing. In contemplative reports considered healthy, the practitioner usually retains orientation, memory, and the ability to recognize the state without building a grand personal mythology around it. Psychedelic experiences complicate the comparison. They can produce awe, unity, terror, insight, confusion, or rapid movement among all of them. Some people report lasting benefits, others experience difficult after effects. The state is chemically driven and often less voluntary than a trained meditative absorption. Similar language does not prove identical neural organization or equal long-term meaning. Even sleep removes the ordinary self. During deep dreamless periods, personal narrative and reportable experience become minimal. Yet few traditions would call unconsciousness liberation. Clarity matters. Memory matters. So the ability to respond wisely matters. Researchers therefore need more than a statement that the ego disappeared. They examine emotional tone, voluntary control, sensory clarity, memory, orientation, functioning, and what happens afterward. Did the person become less reactive or more unstable? Could the state be entered and left intentionally? Did it reduce suffering or merely interrupt ordinary identity? Context changes interpretation. A boundaryless event during a supported retreat may be understood calmly. The same sensations appearing unexpectedly after sleep loss or trauma may cause panic. Training provides language and expectations, but language can also force a dangerous experience into a spiritual story when clinical help is needed. Duration also matters. A brief event may be beautiful without becoming stable. A prolonged change may be beneficial, neutral, or disabling. Researchers need follow-up that lasts beyond the excitement of the first report. Sleep, work, relationships, fear, and decision-making reveal whether the nervous system has integrated the event. Traditional communities developed their own safeguards, though these were never perfect. Teachers compared experiences with conduct, warned against fascination with visions, and placed unusual states within longer training. Modern science can learn from that caution without accepting every traditional interpretation. Both approaches become safer when neither mistakes intensity for truth. This is why ego dissolution is not automatically enlightenment. The loss of identity may be a doorway, a symptom, a temporary state, or an event whose meaning remains uncertain. Freedom requires more than absence. It requires less delusion, less compulsion, and greater capacity to meet reality. The brain scan cannot make this judgment alone. Two people may show overlapping changes while one feels peaceful and the other terrified. The difference may depend on network dynamics, history, body state, interpretation, and support. Biology matters, but experience unfolds inside a life. For the science of contemplation, the best subjects are therefore not merely people who have had unusual events. Researchers seek practitioners who can enter defined states repeatedly, describe transitions with care, and remain stable before and after the experiment. Reproducibility does not prove liberation, but it reduces some ambiguity. That search leads toward the absorptions known as jhanas. These states are described as a sequence, cultivated through long training and sometimes entered on command. They offer scientists something rare in consciousness research, a person who claims to move deliberately through distinct forms of experience, while instruments watch. The next chamber of the mystery is not a monastery alone, but a laboratory built around the staircase of absorption. The word jhāna is often translated as absorption, but the English word only hints at the experience. In ordinary concentration, attention remains vulnerable to sound, memory, discomfort, and desire. In absorption, practitioners describe the mind becoming gathered, unified, and less interested in the usual world. The object of meditation no longer feels like one thing among many. It becomes the stable condition around which experience reorganizes. Entry itself may involve a hidden shift. At first, the meditator seems to place attention on an object. As stability grows, effort becomes quieter, and the object no longer feels separate from the act of attending. The mind is not gripping harder. Competing intentions are falling away. This may explain why force can block absorption. The state depends on unification, while strain keeps producing a controller who is trying to make something happen. The doorway opens when effort becomes steady enough to disappear from the center of experience itself. The early stages are often associated with energy, pleasure, and joy. These feelings do not depend on receiving anything from outside. They may arise as distraction weakens and attention becomes steady. The body can feel light, full, or flooded with waves of well-being. Inner speech may continue at first, then become quieter as the state deepens. Later stages are described differently. Excitement fades. Joy becomes calm contentment. Contentment settles into equanimity. The practitioner is not simply becoming more relaxed with each step. Qualities appear, perform a role, and then become too coarse for the next state. Even pleasure may be released when the mind no longer needs it to remain stable. This progression makes jhāna attractive to researchers. The stages have names, traditional descriptions, and an expected order. Experienced practitioners sometimes claim they can enter them deliberately, remain for a chosen period, and signal transitions. Consciousness research rarely receives such cooperative material. Most unusual states arrive unexpectedly or depend on drugs, illness, dreams, or chance. Here, a person may be able to produce them on request. The staircase metaphor is useful if it is not taken too literally. Traditions disagree about how deep the absorptions must be, how they are entered, and what counts as mastery. One teacher's first jhāna may resemble another teacher's access concentration. Reports vary with language, training, and interpretation. The sequence is structured, but not scientifically standardized. Some advanced descriptions move beyond ordinary form. Awareness may seem boundless like space, then centered on consciousness itself, then on nothingness, and finally on a state so subtle that perception cannot easily be said to be present or absent. Such language sounds supernatural, but the scientific question remains modest. What changes in attention, sensation, self-processing, and network organization when a trained person reports these transitions? Jhāna must also be separated from nirvana. Absorption can produce extraordinary bliss and stability while leaving basic patterns of craving intact. A practitioner may become attached to the states, long for their return, or use them to escape difficult life. Traditional accounts often treat concentration as preparation for insight rather than liberation by itself. This distinction creates a paradox. Jhāna may be easier to map precisely because it is not the whole destination. It is a reproducible state with observable timing, whereas nirvana is described as a transformation in the causes of suffering. Science may therefore map the staircase while remaining unable to prove what lies beyond it. For the practitioner inside the laboratory, the difference is immediate. One stage feels bright and energized, another feels deeply content, another becomes balanced and almost motionless from within. The body in the scanner appears unchanged, but the reported world passes through several configurations. The next question is whether electrical rhythms and reward systems follow those changes. Electrodes can reveal fast activity that magnetic images miss, while imaging can show deeper structures that EEG sees only indirectly. Together, they offer a partial view of a mind-generating joy without an external reward. Before the meditator enters the scanner, researchers place a cap across the scalp. Small sensors record changing voltages produced by large groups of neurons. The lines that appear on the screen rise and fall too quickly for functional MRI to follow. This is the advantage of EEG. It can track the timing of electrical rhythms across fractions of a second. Researchers must also align clocks that operate at different speeds. The practitioner may report a sudden transition. EEG may change within milliseconds, while the blood flow signal, measured by MRI, rises several seconds later. Careful timing is needed to avoid placing the neural effect before or after the experience incorrectly. The task resembles reconstructing lightning from thunder, light, and a witness who must describe the instant while remaining inside the storm. If the clocks are misaligned, a genuine sequence can look random, and a random coincidence can appear like a meaningful neural signature of the state alone. Brain rhythms are named by frequency bands such as delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. These labels can sound like separate channels, but real activity is more complicated. Frequencies overlap, change by region, and participate in many tasks. No band belongs exclusively to meditation, sleep, creativity, or enlightenment. Still, certain findings have captured attention. Research with long-term Buddhist practitioners has reported unusually strong gamma activity and synchrony during some compassion practices. Gamma rhythms are often associated with local processing and communication across distributed areas. The striking recordings suggested that years of training might support forms of large-scale coordination rarely seen in untrained participants. Jhāna studies have reported changes involving alpha, theta, gamma, and very slow activity. Some practitioners show periods of unusual synchrony or high-amplitude rhythms during absorption. The patterns do not form one universal signature. Different stages, people, methods, and recording systems produce different results. Muscle tension, eye movement, and electrical noise can also imitate important signals if researchers are not careful. The most seductive claim concerns bliss. Early absorptions are described as intensely pleasurable, sometimes more powerful than ordinary sensory reward. A combined EEG and fMRI case study explored whether a practitioner could activate reward-related brain systems through meditation alone. The possibility is remarkable. Human well-being is usually tied to food, touch, status, money, novelty, or chemical stimulation. In jhāna, attention itself may help generate a reward state. If confirmed broadly, this would reveal an underused capacity of the nervous system. The brain may not require constant external consumption to produce powerful pleasure. Training could change how attention, bodily sensation, and reward interact. Yet the conclusion must remain narrow. Activating reward circuitry does not prove wisdom. It proves that reward can arise under unusual internal conditions. Pleasure also creates its own trap. A practitioner who learns to produce bliss may begin chasing it. The state becomes another possession, more refined than wealth but still defended by desire. Traditional warnings repeatedly separate concentration from freedom. For this reason, the ability to enter joy does not show the ability to release joy. Gamma activity carries a similar danger. Popular culture treats it as an enlightenment frequency, as though a number on an EEG could certify awakening. But gamma appears during attention, perception, memory, movement, and other processes. It can reveal coordination without revealing the meaning of what is coordinated. The strongest research connects three layers. First is phenomenology, what the practitioner reports at each moment. Second is physiology, the rhythms, blood flow, breathing, and heart changes that accompany the report. Third is reproducibility, whether the pattern returns across sessions and people. Remove any layer, and the interpretation weakens. Even then, electrodes see only part of the event. Signals from deep structures are difficult to localize from the scalp. The thalamus, reward circuits, and brainstem may play important roles that EEG cannot map precisely. Functional imaging can add spatial detail, although it measures more slowly and indirectly. This is why researchers return to ultra-high field scanners. They want to observe how entire networks and deeper hubs reorganize as the practitioner moves through repeated absorptions. The electrical rhythms suggest that something coordinated is occurring. The next scans attempt to reveal where that coordination travels and whether the same internal staircase leaves the same neural footprints each time. Inside a 7 Tesla scanner, small changes become easier to distinguish. The stronger magnetic field can provide unusually detailed images, though it also increases technical challenges. Every movement matters. Breathing, swallowing, and tiny shifts of the head can create noise. The practitioner must enter delicate states while confined in a loud machine, wearing headphones, surrounded by instructions and measurement. In intensive jhāna research, an adept practitioner has completed many scanning runs while entering multiple absorptions. Studying one person repeatedly allows researchers to examine reliability within that individual. If the same reported stage appears with a similar pattern across sessions, the finding becomes stronger than a single dramatic scan. Analyses have reported changes involving the thalamus, default mode regions, attention and control systems, somatomotor areas, limbic structures, and temporoparietal networks. Researchers have also examined connectivity, hierarchical organization, and the way the brain moves among dynamic states over time. The emerging picture is not one enlightenment center, it is a shifting architecture. The thalamus is especially interesting because it helps regulate the flow of sensory information and communication across the cortex. During deep absorption, ordinary sensory input may lose priority, while internally generated stability becomes dominant. Changes involving the thalamus could help explain why sound, body boundaries, and external concerns fade without unconsciousness. Dynamic analysis adds another layer. A standard image averages activity across time, but absorption unfolds through transitions. The brain may occupy one configuration, shift into another, stabilize, then move again. Mapping these changes could reveal whether reported stages correspond with distinct patterns rather than variations of one general meditative condition. The first great reveal is that the practitioner appears capable of producing measurable configurations voluntarily. Profound altered states do not have to arrive through drugs, disease, or accident. Training may allow a person to navigate consciousness with a precision that ordinary waking life never demands. The second reveal limits the first. Detailed early maps have often depended on one exceptional practitioner. Intensive sampling provides depth, not broad generality. A reliable pattern in one brain may reflect personal anatomy, a specific teaching method, or an unusual talent. It cannot establish that every person enters the same jhāna through the same route. Group studies of highly trained practitioners are beginning to widen the picture, but recruitment remains difficult. Few people have the required experience, and definitions of mastery vary. Even experts may use the same stage name for different depths of absorption. There is a further question of interpretation. The researcher sees a network pattern. The practitioner recognizes joy, equanimity, or vastness. Neither description can replace the other. Biological language explains measurable organization. Contemplative language describes how that organization feels and how it functions within training. A mature study must hold both accounts together without pretending they are identical. Replication will also require ordinary controls, resting quietly, imagining the state, performing focused attention, and entering neighboring stages. Only then can researchers determine which features belong specifically to absorption and which reflect relaxation, expectation, or the unusual environment of the scanner. Without these comparisons, the beautiful pattern may still belong to the machine room. The clearest map may therefore be a map of one person's mountain. It proves that the mountain exists for that traveler and that the path can be walked repeatedly. It does not prove that every traveler will see the same landscape. Still, the scientific importance remains. Conscious states once considered too private or unstable for measurement are becoming testable through repeated collaboration between practitioner and laboratory. The scanner cannot determine whether the state is liberating, but it can show that deliberate mental training corresponds with organized biological change. Absorption demonstrates control over attention, reward, and conscious structure. Nirvana asks a harder question. What happens to fear when the threat is real, to anger when another person wounds pride, and to compassion when suffering cannot be escaped? The investigation must now leave bliss behind and follow the practitioner back into relationship. The scanner door opens, and the practitioner returns to an ordinary hallway. Shoes are tied, forms are signed, someone asks a repetitive question, traffic waits outside. The unusual state has ended, but the deeper claim of contemplative training is only beginning to be tested. Enlightenment cannot be entirely private. A person may experience unity, silence, or boundless joy while alone. Yet liberation traditions repeatedly connect insight with conduct. Greed should weaken. Hatred should lose authority. Compassion should become less dependent on convenience. If nothing changes in relationship, the inner event remains difficult to distinguish from a beautiful escape. Compassion also complicates the idea that advanced practice should reduce emotion. Some training may soften unnecessary reactivity while increasing sensitivity to suffering. The practitioner may cry more easily, yet recover more quickly, or feel another person's pain without converting it into resentment. From outside, this can look less detached than the stereotype of enlightenment. The transformation lies not in emotional silence, but in freedom from the defensive habits that normally decide which feelings are permitted. In that sense, a quieter ego may make the heart more available, not less affected by the world around it. This creates a challenge for the modern image of awakening. Popular culture often presents the enlightened person as permanently serene, detached from disturbance, and floating above ordinary concern. But calm can be produced by withdrawal. A person can avoid conflict, suppress emotion, or protect a peaceful environment. Freedom must be tested where other lives interrupt the private world. Compassion practice turns deliberately toward that interruption. The meditator brings suffering to mind rather than removing it from awareness. A loved person may be imagined first, then a stranger, then someone difficult. Warmth is extended beyond the boundaries that normally decide who deserves care. The exercise exposes resistance, fear, judgment, and the hidden wish that another person's pain remain distant. Loving kindness practices train goodwill, but they are not meant to create permanent sweetness. They explore whether the mind can wish well without requiring agreement, reward, or closeness. Compassion adds sensitivity to suffering and a motivation to respond. Equanimity provides balance so that caring does not collapse into panic or exhaustion. The neural path toward liberation may therefore return to the world rather than leave it. A softened self-boundary could reduce defensive separation. Another person's pain is no longer treated as an irrelevant event outside the protected center. Yet boundaries cannot disappear completely. Healthy compassion still requires judgment, consent, and the ability to act without becoming overwhelmed. This is where the testimony of others becomes important. A practitioner may feel peaceful while appearing distant. A teacher may describe universal love while students experience fear. Self-report cannot settle the question, because spiritual identity can shape what a person believes about his own motives. The strongest evidence may be ordinary. Does the person listen without preparing a defense? Can he apologize without protecting status? Does patience remain when no audience is present? Are vulnerable people safer around him? These questions do not reject neuroscience. They reveal what neuroscience must eventually connect with its maps. The first twist of this chapter is that awakening may be visible in another person's nervous system. A calm, trustworthy presence can reduce fear in those nearby. Consistent care changes relationships, and relationships influence bodies and brains. Enlightenment, if it exists as a lasting human transformation, may leave traces distributed across a community, rather than contained inside one skull. The practitioner steps into traffic, horns sound. Someone cuts across the lane. The test is no longer whether attention can remain stable in a magnet. It is whether irritation becomes hatred, whether fear becomes aggression, and whether another person's humanity remains visible under pressure. Compassion sounds poetic, but it is built from measurable processes: attention, bodily arousal, pain perception, motivation, memory, and regulation. The next section follows what happens when the brain encounters suffering and learns not to flee. A face tightens in pain, and the observer's body responds before thought explains why. Attention locks onto the expression. Muscles prepare. The chest changes. Memories of similar suffering may appear. Within moments, another person's distress has entered the observer's nervous system. This response can move in several directions. One person feels concern and approaches. Another becomes overwhelmed and turns away. A third protects himself through numbness or judgment. The sight of suffering does not automatically produce compassionate action. It can produce fear, helplessness, anger, guilt, or avoidance. Compassion training attempts to preserve sensitivity while reducing collapse. The practitioner learns to remain near pain without making the pain entirely about himself. This is different from empathy understood as sharing another person's feeling without distance. Pure emotional resonance can become exhausting. Compassion adds steadiness and the wish to help. Breathing and heart rhythms may participate in this balance. When threat dominates, the body prepares for protection, narrowing attention and reducing flexibility. Slow, steady awareness can support recovery, allowing the observer to remain oriented toward another person, rather than becoming trapped in personal alarm. These bodily changes do not create compassion by themselves, but they may provide the physical conditions in which concern can become thoughtful action instead of reflexive escape. The deepest training may be the refusal to look away, while also refusing to become the center of the scene. Care remains present, yet the nervous system no longer demands that every wound be carried as a catastrophe forever afterward. Studies of compassion and mindfulness training have examined attention, autonomic balance, amygdala response, emotion regulation, and pro-social behavior. Some longitudinal work has reported reduced anxiety and lower amygdala activity during negative emotional processing compared with relaxation training. Other studies suggest that different practices produce distinct patterns. Empathic resonance may strengthen systems linked with shared distress, while compassion practice may recruit affiliation, positive motivation, and regulation. The amygdala is often described as the brain's fear center, but this is too simple. It helps detect biologically and emotionally relevant events, including uncertainty and reward. Reduced activity in one condition does not mean fear has been removed. The significance depends on the task, the person, and the wider network. The more interesting possibility is that training changes the sequence of response. Suffering is recognized, bodily feeling appears, attention remains present, yet the observer adds less panic, avoidance, and personal story. There is concern without immediate drowning. Equanimity can look cold from the outside, especially when it lacks dramatic emotion. But stable care may require less visible distress. A surgeon must remain clear while another body is injured. A parent must soothe a frightened child without becoming equally frightened. Calm does not prove compassion, but compassion sometimes depends on calm. The reverse is also true. Emotional intensity does not prove care. A person can be devastated by another's pain while becoming unable to listen or act. The suffering of the observer takes center stage, and the original person must now provide comfort. Training seeks another balance, openness without possession. This has practical meaning for caregivers, medical workers, families, and anyone repeatedly exposed to distress. If the nervous system can learn to remain responsive without constant overload, compassion becomes more sustainable. The goal is not to feel less human. It is to avoid turning every contact with pain into an emergency organized around the self. Traditional descriptions often say that wisdom and compassion grow together. Seeing the self as less separate may increase concern for others, while compassion prevents insight from becoming sterile detachment. Science has begun to examine these processes separately, but their interaction may be central. What looks like supernatural calm may therefore be trained tolerance for the full movement of suffering. The person feels the signal, understands its importance, and is not forced to escape through numbness, anger, or denial. A scan can suggest regulation, but it cannot show what the person chooses when help is costly. For that, the investigation must leave images and enter behavior, generosity, honesty, restraint, and the decisions made when no scientist is watching. A laboratory can measure reaction time, heart rate, and brain activity with extraordinary precision. It can present images of suffering, offer small financial choices, or create controlled social rejection. But liberation claims concern the disorderly world beyond the experiment, where motives are mixed and consequences last. A serious science of enlightenment would need behavioral signatures. Does generosity remain when giving carries a real cost? Does honesty survive when deception would protect reputation? Can a person receive criticism without punishing the speaker? Does power increase care or expose hidden entitlement? These questions are harder than measuring a meditative state, because people change under observation. A participant knows when generosity is being tested. A spiritual teacher knows which answers sound awakened. Self-report questionnaires can reveal useful patterns, but they can also measure ideals, vocabulary, and the desire to appear consistent. Long-term observation would provide stronger evidence. Researchers could follow practitioners across years, examine stress recovery, relationships, compulsive reward-seeking, conflict, and willingness to repair harm. Family members, co-workers, students, and independent observers could describe changes that the practitioner does not see. Ethical change may also appear through recovery rather than perfection. An awakened person, if such a person can be studied, might still feel irritation or make mistakes. The meaningful difference could be how quickly the error is recognized, how little it is defended, and whether repair follows without manipulation. This is more realistic than searching for a human being who never experiences conflict. Power must be included as well. Behavior under equal conditions may hide tendencies that appear only when someone controls money, access, loyalty, or reputation. A complete study would observe what practice does when consequences fall mainly on people with less power, where hidden motives become harder to disguise completely. This approach would also expose uncomfortable contradictions. Attention can be trained without equal growth in ethics. A person may sit motionless for hours yet remain controlling. A teacher may understand subtle states while using status to protect desire. Communities may interpret criticism as ignorance and treat charisma as proof of realization. The brain scan cannot cancel behavior. If an image suggests reduced self-focus while the person repeatedly harms others, the method has measured something narrower than liberation. Neural expertise is not moral immunity. Spiritual identity creates another trap. The practitioner may become proud of humility, attached to simplicity, or defensive about being beyond defense. Praise from a community strengthens the role. Doubt becomes threatening because it challenges not only a belief, but a carefully built self called the awakened one. This is not a reason to dismiss contemplative attainment. It is a reason to measure it more honestly. Extraordinary concentration, compassion, and insight may be real while remaining incomplete. Human development is uneven. Skill in one domain does not guarantee maturity in every other. Behavioral economics can test choices involving fairness, trust, and sacrifice. Clinical interviews can explore motivation and blind spots. Daily experience sampling can record anger, desire, and recovery close to the moment they occur. Reports from others can reveal whether claimed transformation is visible in shared life. Even these methods have limits. A generous choice may come from compassion, fear of judgment, or desire for identity. A calm response may reflect wisdom or emotional suppression. No single behavior functions as a certificate. Patterns across time matter more than isolated performances. The chapter's final reveal is that Enlightenment science may need multiple witnesses. The practitioner knows the inner release. The scanner sees biological change. Other people experience the consequences. None possesses the whole truth alone. A person may control attention for hours and remain controlled by pride in being the person who can do it. The forgotten measure is whether training reduces the need to protect that image. Once behavior becomes part of the map, the investigation meets its deepest methodological barrier. Consciousness is directly available only from within, while conduct is visible only from outside. No machine can enter another person's freedom. The next chapter examines how science studies an invisible world without mistaking either report or measurement for the whole. A scanner records changes in blood oxygen. An EEG cap records voltage at the scalp. A heart monitor records rhythm. None records what silence feels like from within. The instruments can follow the body around consciousness, but the experience itself remains available only to the person having it. This is the central measurement trap. Science depends on observation that can be checked by others. Consciousness is private. A researcher can see that a participant presses a button, reports unity, or enters a repeatable brain pattern. The researcher cannot directly taste the joy, absence of ownership, or release that the participant describes. Meditation research therefore depends on first-person data. Practitioners describe whether attention felt narrow or open, whether thought continued, whether the body remained distinct, and whether effort was present. Advanced meditators may be especially useful because training can make subtle transitions easier to recognize. They may notice when joy becomes equanimity or when the sense of an observer weakens. One method is to train the report itself. Before scanning, the practitioner and interviewer agree on distinctions: effortful or effortless, narrow or spacious, pleasant or neutral, self-centered or centerless. The participant practices signaling transitions without disturbing the state. Afterward, the interview returns to specific moments rather than asking for a single summary. This cannot make experience public, but it makes the bridge stable. Agreement across practitioners also helps, though agreement is not proof. Similar descriptions arising from different traditions may point toward a common feature. They may also reflect shared language, suggestion, or researchers selecting the reports that fit. Convergence becomes meaningful only when differences are preserved beside similarities. Neurophenomenology attempts to join these reports with biological measurement. The participant is not treated as a passive object. He becomes a trained collaborator who describes experience with precision. Researchers compare reports across sessions, align them with timing markers, and look for neural patterns that return with the same reported state. This approach respects a fact that brain science sometimes forgets. A pattern means little without knowing what the person was experiencing. The same outward stillness can contain boredom, concentration, sleepiness, fear, or absorption. A decrease in one network cannot be interpreted without context. Yet introspection is not a perfect window. Memory changes an experience while it is being recalled. Expectations influence what is noticed. A tradition gives practitioners categories, and those categories may shape the event itself. Someone trained to expect a sequence of stages may interpret ambiguous changes according to that sequence. Language adds another barrier. Two people may use the word emptiness for different experiences. One may mean emotional numbness. Another may mean the absence of fixed identity. A third may mean spacious attention. Conversely, two traditions may describe similar events through entirely different vocabularies. Researchers can improve reliability by using structured interviews, immediate reports, repeated sessions, and questions about concrete features rather than grand labels. Was inner speech present? Could the body boundary be located? Did time feel continuous? Was the state voluntary? What happened when a sound appeared? Such questions divide a mystical word into observable dimensions without assuming the word has one meaning. But division can also destroy what matters. A song cannot be understood only by counting notes. The lived unity of an experience may disappear when reduced to separate ratings. Science must simplify enough to compare, while preserving enough to remain faithful. The practitioner's report is therefore neither unquestionable truth nor useless noise. It is evidence with strengths and weaknesses. The biological measurement is the same. Each constrains the other. A dramatic claim without a corresponding pattern deserves caution. A dramatic pattern without a credible experience report also remains uncertain. The only witness who can describe the state is inside the mind being examined. The scientist can ask, compare, and test, but can never stand where the witness stands. This problem becomes more dangerous when studies are small, definitions are vague, and public headlines demand certainty. The next section follows a modest finding as it travels from laboratory language into a promise that meditation has permanently rewritten the human brain. A study begins with a careful sentence. In a small group, after a limited training period, researchers observe an association between one practice and one measurement. The result may be statistically significant, but uncertain. The paper describes limitations and calls for replication. Then the finding leaves the paper. A university announcement removes some caution. A news headline announces that meditation rewires the brain. Social media turns change into permanent transformation. A commercial program repeats the claim beside a subscription button. Within days, a narrow result becomes a fact that appears too familiar to question. Meditation research is especially vulnerable to this journey because the public already wants the conclusion. Many participants hope the practice will help. Researchers may be personally interested in contemplative traditions. Journalists prefer a simple conflict between ancient wisdom and modern proof. Positive results travel more easily than null findings. Publication bias shapes the visible field. Positive findings are more exciting to journals and institutions, while unsuccessful replications may remain unpublished. The public then sees a shelf filled with successes and mistakes abundance for certainty. Meta-analysis can help, but it cannot recover studies that were never shared. Researchers also face a conflict of storytelling. Scientific papers reward caution, while public attention rewards transformation. The phrase "associated with" becomes causes. A result observed after training becomes permanent. A group average becomes a promise to every individual. Each change makes the story easier to remember and less faithful to the evidence that created it. The distortion rarely begins with fraud. It grows through incentives that favor wonder over precision at every step. Small samples create unstable estimates. A striking difference found among 20 people may shrink or disappear in a larger group. Participants often select themselves, bringing unusual motivation, education, health, and belief. Experienced meditators may have lifestyles that differ from controls in dozens of ways. The control group is another challenge. Comparing meditation with doing nothing cannot reveal whether benefits come from the specific mental practice, quiet rest, social support, teacher attention, expectation, or taking time away from stress. Strong studies use active controls that are equally believable and demanding. Definitions shift as well. One study calls a person expert after several retreats. Another requires thousands of hours. Training programs use the same label while teaching different exercises. When these findings are combined, the average may conceal practices and people who were never truly comparable. Brain imaging introduces many analytical choices. Researchers decide how to clean noise, divide regions, model timing, and set statistical thresholds. When many outcomes are tested, some positive result can appear by chance. Pre-registration reduces this freedom by recording key questions and methods before the data are seen. A colored brain cluster creates a final illusion. It looks like a photographed object, but it is the visible end of a statistical comparison. The color does not show compassion, ego, or enlightenment. It shows where a selected measure differed under selected assumptions. Reverse inference deepens the problem. If a region has been associated with attention, and that region becomes active, a headline may claim that attention increased, but most brain regions support many functions. Activity alone cannot reveal the exact mental process. Good research does not avoid interpretation. It keeps interpretation proportional to evidence. Larger samples, active controls, precise practice descriptions, blinded assessment, pre-registered analysis, replication, and publication of failures all strengthen the field. So does measuring behavior, rather than relying only on scans and questionnaires. The brightest image may reveal less than the plain paragraph explaining who was studied and how. Mystery should not depend on exaggeration. The real discovery is strong enough to survive uncertainty. Mental training appears capable of influencing attention and experience, but the size, mechanism, and durability of those effects vary. Weak methods can overstate benefits. They can also hide events that do not fit the public story of meditation as universally peaceful. When difficulty is excluded from reports or blamed on the practitioner, the map becomes not only incomplete, but unsafe. The next section enters the part of the path often removed from advertisements. Meditation is commonly presented as a gentle practice with only positive effects. For many people, moderate training is uneventful or helpful. Yet others report anxiety, panic, insomnia, involuntary movement, traumatic memory, sensory distortion, emotional flooding, depersonalization, loss of meaning, or difficulty functioning. These experiences do not all have the same cause or seriousness. A brief wave of sadness during quiet observation differs from prolonged terror or inability to sleep. Some traditions expect periods of fear, emptiness, or disorientation during intensive insight practice. A temporary challenge may resolve with guidance. Another experience may require stopping practice and seeking clinical support. Risk depends on context. Several minutes of basic attention training is not the same as weeks of silence, long daily sessions, reduced sleep, fasting, or isolation. Prior trauma, mental health history, medical conditions, teacher competence, and social support can shape what happens. The same practice may be stabilizing for one person and overwhelming for another. The Varieties of Contemplative Experience project documented a broad range of meditation-related difficulties. Its importance lies not in proving that meditation is dangerous, but in making ignored experiences visible. When research asks only whether participants became calmer, it may never discover that some became frightened, numb, or unable to work. Intensity can arrive gradually. A practitioner sleeps a little less, sits a little longer, and begins interpreting every sensation as progress. Friends notice agitation, but the retreat culture praises endurance. By the time the person asks for help, the unusual state has become part of identity. Stepping back now feels like abandoning a discovery. Safety does not require removing challenge from practice. It requires informed consent, appropriate screening, realistic expectations, and permission to adjust. Grounding activities, regular meals, sleep, movement, conversation, and shorter sessions can sometimes restore balance. When symptoms are severe, professional assessment may be necessary. Long-term follow-up is essential because difficulty can begin after a retreat ends. The protected environment disappears, ordinary demands return, and the practitioner may struggle to integrate sensitivity or altered perception. Research that stops at the final class can miss the moment when support is needed most. The safest path leaves room for both spiritual meaning and medical reality without forcing either one to disappear. Spiritual interpretation can help or harm. A teacher may normalize a difficult stage and prevent unnecessary panic, but a community may also label severe symptoms as purification, ego resistance, or evidence of progress. The practitioner then remains inside a harmful situation because leaving feels like failure. Clinical interpretation has its own risk. Not every unusual experience is illness. A temporary change in body boundaries during deep practice may be meaningful and manageable. Treating every contemplative event as pathology can remove context and frighten the person further. Responsible care requires both discernment and humility. Researchers should record adverse events systematically, define intensity and impairment, follow participants after training, and provide clear routes to support. Teachers should know when a problem exceeds their competence. Clinicians should ask about practice type, duration, retreat conditions, sleep, and community interpretation. The strongest twist is that a spiritual breakthrough and destabilization can coexist. An experience may contain genuine insight while also overwhelming the nervous system. Meaning does not cancel harm. Harm does not prove that every insight was false. This complexity resists the simple debate between believers and skeptics. Meditation is neither universally safe nor inherently dangerous. It is a family of practices interacting with different bodies, histories, and conditions. The doorway beyond the familiar self can open into peace. It can also open into fear and a world that no longer feels real. A mature science must study both outcomes with the same seriousness. Once the benefits, limitations, and risks become visible, a modern temptation appears. If years of training are difficult and uncertain, perhaps technology can produce the desired brain patterns more quickly. The investigation now turns towards screens, feedback loops, chemical shortcuts, and the dream of engineered awakening. A participant sits before a screen and watches a line rise and fall. The line represents activity from a selected part of the brain, processed quickly enough to appear almost in real time. No one tells the participant exactly what thought will move it. He experiments with breathing, attention, memory, openness, and effort, learning through the display which inner strategies change the signal. This is neurofeedback, an electronic mirror that reflects a small piece of biological activity back to the person producing it. EEG systems use electrical rhythms measured at the scalp. Real-time fMRI can target deeper or more precisely located regions, though the signal arrives with delay. In both cases, the person enters a loop: attempt, measurement, feedback, adjustment. Researchers have explored whether this loop can help people regulate systems associated with emotion, pain, trauma, attention, and self-related processing. Some mindfulness studies have focused on the posterior cingulate cortex, a central hub in the default mode network. Participants report strategies, while the display indicates whether activity moves in the expected direction. The idea is seductive. If experienced meditators show a pattern linked with reduced self-focus, perhaps beginners can learn that pattern directly. Years of uncertain practice might be shortened by immediate information. A wandering mind would no longer wait for subtle recognition. The machine would reveal the drift. Closed-loop systems extend the possibility. The program could adapt in response to the user's current state, changing sound, instruction, or stimulation when attention weakens. Artificial intelligence could search for patterns too complex for a single line and personalize training to each brain. But the mirror shows only what researchers choose to reflect. A decrease in one region may accompany effortless awareness in one person and drowsiness in another. The participant may discover a strategy that changes the display without producing the intended experience. He learns to win the neurological game, rather than cultivate wisdom. There is also a problem of dependency. If the practitioner learns only while receiving feedback, the skill may weaken when the screen disappears. A useful system must eventually make itself unnecessary, transferring recognition from the device to ordinary awareness. Otherwise, calm becomes another condition that requires equipment, calibration, and access. Researchers must ask whether the learned change generalizes. Can the participant notice rumination while walking, arguing, or lying awake without the electronic signal? Does regulation remain months later? The real success of an external mirror would be the moment the person no longer needs to look into it through every changing circumstance. Networks also resist simple control. A region participates in many functions and communicates with others. Changing one signal can alter several processes, while the same mental strategy may produce different effects across sessions. The feedback is delayed, noisy, and filtered through analysis. Even successful regulation proves something limited. It shows that a person learned to influence a measurement. It does not show reduced greed, compassion under pressure, or insight into the self. A calm pattern can be generated for reasons unrelated to liberation. Neurofeedback may still become valuable. It could help beginners recognize mental effort, support clinical treatment, or reveal individual differences in how meditation works. The technology is most promising as an aid to learning, not an electronic certificate. The deepest question is whether inner freedom can be separated from the path that develops it. Traditional training includes ethics, patience, community, failure, and the gradual discovery of hidden motives. A machine may reproduce one neural condition without reproducing the character formed through years of meeting difficulty. If a screen could show the brain moving towards selfless awareness, following the signal might open a door. It might also teach the self to become proud of controlling another score. Neurofeedback guides the brain through repeated learning. Other methods can alter self-boundaries within hours, with little training at all. The next comparison places the long contemplative path beside the rapid and controversial route of psychedelic ego dissolution. In one room, a practitioner sits after years of disciplined training. Attention has been stabilized through thousands of returns. The sense of self becomes thin, and the boundary between observer and world loosens. In another room, a participant receives a psychedelic substance under controlled conditions. Within hours, ordinary identity may dissolve into unity, timelessness, fear, or overwhelming meaning. The descriptions sometimes sound remarkably similar. Both may include loss of self-boundaries, intensified present experience, sacredness, interconnectedness, and the sense that familiar reality was only one possible arrangement. This overlap has drawn the attention of consciousness researchers. Psychedelic substances can rapidly change perception, emotion, and communication among large-scale brain networks. Studies examine increased flexibility, altered hierarchy, and reduced stability in patterns associated with the ordinary self. The brain may enter a more variable condition, in which established models loosen and unusual connections become possible. Meditation usually approaches change through training and repeated regulation. Psychedelics alter neurochemistry directly, and the experience can be less controllable. The difference does not make one route authentic and the other false. It means similar reports may arise through different mechanisms and carry different risks. Preparation may be one of the hidden variables. Long practice gives the meditator concepts, attentional skills, and a community that can interpret unusual experience. Controlled psychedelic studies attempt to create preparation through screening, intention, trusted support, and later integration. In both routes, the state is shaped by what surrounds it. Set and setting are not decorative. Expectation, safety, music, culture, relationship, and fear can influence whether loosened identity feels like liberation or threat. The same chemical action does not produce the same story in every mind. The same is true of meditation. A state occurs within training, biography, and belief. Without that surrounding frame, researchers may compare similar words while overlooking the different roads that gave those words meaning. For some participants, a psychedelic experience becomes meaningful for months or years. Clinical research investigates whether carefully supported sessions can reduce certain forms of depression, anxiety, trauma-related distress, or addiction. These studies occur under screening, preparation, monitoring, and integration. They do not justify unsupervised use, which can involve psychological, legal, medical, and environmental danger. The central question is whether ego dissolution equals insight. A person can experience the self as constructed without learning how to respond when the self returns. The ordinary identity often rebuilds within hours, then begins telling a new story. I saw the truth. I am different from those who have not. The experience that weakened ego can become material for a more dramatic ego. Contemplative traditions anticipated a similar problem with visions and bliss. An extraordinary event is not judged only by intensity. Its value depends on understanding, integration, and conduct. Does it reduce compulsion? Does it increase honesty? Can the person tolerate ordinary life without chasing another revelation? A shortcut to the state may not be a shortcut to the trait. Attention stability, emotional regulation, ethical restraint, and compassion are skills. They may support the experience, emerge from it, or develop independently. But they are not automatically installed by a few hours of boundarylessness. The reverse caution also matters. Years of meditation do not guarantee integration, and gradual training can also produce pride or destabilization. Time spent is not proof. The comparison is not between a pure ancient path and a corrupt modern shortcut. It is between different ways of changing consciousness, each requiring evidence and care. The most useful research may examine common dimensions rather than declaring equivalence. How does self-processing change? Is the state voluntary? What happens to fear, prediction, and network flexibility? Which changes persist, and what support helps people live with them. Science may learn how to dissolve ordinary identity in an afternoon. It still does not know how to prevent identity from rebuilding around the memory of dissolution. Whether the route uses meditation, chemistry, stimulation, or feedback, a modern market quickly forms around the promise. The next section follows enlightenment as it becomes an application, a wearable, a retreat package, and a score sold back to the searching self. A phone vibrates with a reminder to become present. A wearable headband scores the depth of a session. A retreat advertisement promises transformation in a luxury setting. An artificial voice offers personalized wisdom. Around ancient practices, a new market has formed, selling attention to people whose attention is already being bought and divided by other platforms. Commercial adaptation is not automatically corrupt. Applications can make basic instruction available across distance and language. Wearables may help some users build consistency. Secular programs can offer useful skills without requiring religious belief. Clinical settings can translate contemplative methods for people seeking relief from stress or pain. The danger begins when accessibility becomes certainty. A product must explain why it is worth buying, and uncertainty is difficult to sell. Preliminary research becomes proof. Calm becomes guaranteed. Complex traditions are reduced to minutes completed, streaks maintained, and brain scores improved. A subtler loss occurs when ethics are removed from the product. Attention becomes a neutral performance skill. It can help a surgeon remain steady, but it can also help a manipulator study another person more closely. Concentration alone does not choose a humane purpose. Traditional systems often placed mental training beside restraint, generosity, and responsibility, because a sharper mind can serve harmful desire as efficiently as compassionate action. Sleep marketing adds another contradiction. A calm voice may use contemplative language to help listeners rest, which can be genuinely beneficial. Yet the platform may interrupt that calm with incentives designed to keep them listening, clicking, and returning. Serenity and engagement are sold by the same machine. The listener seeks release while the system measures how long attention remains captured. Measurement changes motivation. The user begins practicing to raise a number. A session that felt open is judged as failure because the device scored it poorly. Another session earns a high score, and pride becomes the hidden reward. The technology designed to loosen attachment creates a new object of attachment. Data adds a deeper concern. Brain signals, emotional patterns, sleep, mood, and private reflections are unusually intimate. A company that collects them may learn when a user is vulnerable, distracted, anxious, or receptive. The path towards self-knowledge can become a source of behavioral prediction for someone else. Employers may adopt mindfulness to improve productivity while ignoring conditions that create exhaustion. Workers are taught to breathe through unreasonable demands rather than change them. The individual becomes responsible for adapting calmly to a harmful system. An ancient critique of craving is transformed into a tool for maintaining the machinery of craving. Retreat culture can also turn awakening into status. Rare states become achievements. Teachers become brands. High prices imply depth. Participants compare experiences and learn the vocabulary that signals belonging. The self returns wearing simpler clothing and speaking about having no self. Artificial intelligence may eventually generate instructions from vast collections of contemplative texts, adapt exercises to real-time signals, and imitate the voice of a patient teacher. It may increase access, but it cannot assume moral responsibility, understand a person's full history, or replace trustworthy human support during destabilization. The chapter's strongest question is who benefits when enlightenment becomes measurable. The user may gain insight. The company gains data and recurring payment. The employer gains a calmer worker. The platform gains engagement. A score presented as personal freedom may serve systems the user never sees. None of this proves that technology has no place in contemplative practice. It proves that tools inherit the goals of those who design and fund them. A feedback device can support awareness or intensify self-monitoring. An application can guide rest or turn rest into another performance. The final trap is an ego that no longer boasts about wealth, strength, or status, but about how completely it has transcended ego. The market understands this desire and offers endless symbols of arrival. After ancient maps, neural scans, non-dual states, jhāna, compassion, adverse effects, feedback, and chemical shortcuts, the investigation can finally return to its opening question. What has science truly mapped, and how far does the map remain from freedom itself? The investigation began with a man lying inside a 7 Tesla scanner, and a question that seemed almost impossible. Could science map the neural pathway to enlightenment? After ancient teachings, shifting networks, altered states, compassion, measurement problems, and technological shortcuts, the answer is clearer, though not simpler. Focused attention practice can train stability and the repeated recovery from distraction. Open monitoring can change the relationship to thoughts, sensations, and emotion. Long-term practice is associated with differences in attention, interoception, self-related processing, and regulation. Advanced practitioners can enter unusual absorptions while measurable brain patterns change with them. Reports of non-dual awareness suggest that the ordinary division between inner self and outer world is not the only organization consciousness can take. 3 levels of conclusion must remain separate. Established findings show that meditation can influence attention, emotion, and large-scale brain activity under specific conditions. Reasonable hypotheses suggest that repeated training may alter the confidence of self-models, improve network flexibility, and support less reactive behavior. Unanswered questions concern whether these changes converge in advanced practitioners, how long they last, and whether any pattern corresponds with liberation as traditions understand it. Keeping these levels apart protects the mystery from false certainty. The strongest documentary does not need to pretend that the final room has been opened. The locked door is part of the evidence. It shows where measurement ends and where interpretation, philosophy, and lived conduct still begin. Without this discipline, discovery becomes advertising, and uncertainty is treated as an embarrassment rather than the honest shape of knowledge still being formed now. These findings matter. They challenge the belief that the familiar mind is fixed. Attention can be trained. Reward may become less dependent on external objects. Self-related thought can become less dominant. Conscious states that once seemed too private for science can sometimes be entered repeatedly enough for careful study. But the evidence does not reveal one enlightenment circuit. No region lights up and certifies liberation. The default mode network is not the ego. Gamma is not awakening. Bliss is not freedom. Ego dissolution is not wisdom. A changed scan is not a changed character. What science has mapped are components and conditions. It has begun to identify how attention returns, how self-narrative interacts with control, how absorption reorganizes networks, how compassion may regulate distress, and how experience can become centerless while clarity remains. These pieces may belong to a path, but they do not define its final meaning. The title of the investigation therefore contains a useful exaggeration. Scientists map the neural pathways to enlightenment. Sounds as though the destination has been found. In reality, researchers are surveying territory described by practitioners and searching for reliable landmarks. Some landmarks appear across studies. Others remain visible only in exceptional cases. A universal pathway may not exist. Different practices could reach similar traits through different mechanisms. Individual brains vary. Traditions define liberation differently. Culture shapes the language of experience. The path may resemble a network of roots, rather than one road hidden in the skull. The strongest evidence also lies beyond the scanner. Lasting transformation should affect craving, fear, anger, compassion, honesty, and recovery from conflict. Those changes require longitudinal observation and multiple witnesses. They are slower, less dramatic, and more difficult to publish than a bright image. Still, uncertainty is not failure. The fact that science has not captured Nirvana does not mean nothing has been learned. It means the question has become more precise. Researchers can now distinguish state from trait, correlation from cause, attention from ethics, and extraordinary experience from liberation. The map is real. The word enlightenment was simply written across a territory larger than the current evidence. The next step is not another sensational scan of one remarkable person. It is a study broad enough to follow transformation across years, traditions, bodies, relationships, and ordinary life. Such an experiment has not yet been completed, but its shape can already be imagined. The ideal study would begin before intensive practice, when participants still carry their ordinary habits into the laboratory. Hundreds of people from different contemplative traditions would be followed for years. Their methods would be described precisely, rather than placed beneath one label. Breath concentration, open monitoring, compassion, insight, non-dual practice, and absorption would be treated as distinct forms of training. The study would need enough diversity to avoid mistaking one culture for the human mind. Age, gender, language, education, health, and social conditions influence both practice and brain measurement. Traditions from different regions would need equal voice, not merely serve as sources of techniques for laboratories elsewhere. Researchers would also examine dose without assuming that more is always better. 10 minutes daily, residential retreat, and decades of monastic training are different exposures. Benefits may rise, level off, or reverse under certain conditions. The study must be able to discover thresholds, individual vulnerability, and practices that help particular people rather than searching for one prescription for everyone. That complexity would make the results harder to summarize, but more useful to real lives. Brain imaging would provide only one layer. Functional MRI could examine network activity and connectivity. EEG could follow rapid transitions. Measures of breathing, heart rhythm, sleep, stress hormones, and movement would reveal how the body participates. Cognitive tasks could test attention, memory, flexibility, and response inhibition. The study would also enter daily life. Participants would record moments of craving, anger, fear, and recovery close to when they occur. Behavioral tasks would test generosity, fairness, and honesty under real cost. Clinical interviews would examine motivation, identity, and adverse effects. Family members, colleagues, and teachers would report whether changes are visible outside meditation. Advanced states would be measured repeatedly. A practitioner claiming jhāna or non-dual awareness would return across sessions and laboratories. Researchers would compare the state with rest, focused attention, imagination, drowsiness, and neighboring stages. Reports would use concrete features and structured interviews rather than relying only on traditional labels. Active control groups would receive training that is equally demanding, meaningful, and social. They might learn music, physical coordination, relaxation, or another skill. This would help separate the effects of meditation from expectation, community, time, and disciplined learning. The project would be pre-registered. Key questions and analyses would be declared before results were known. Null findings and failed replications would be published. Adverse events would be monitored openly. Cultural scholars and contemplative teachers would help define experiences, while independent researchers would protect the study from becoming promotional. Most importantly, the experiment would not search for one final region. It would look for a multidimensional pattern. Can a person enter unusual states reliably? Do those states lead to stable traits? Does attention become flexible? Does compulsive reward-seeking weaken? Does compassion survive stress? Does behavior change when status and power are involved? Even a successful study would not deliver an ultimate definition of nirvana. It would produce an operational model, a set of measurable changes that correspond with certain contemplative claims. The model could be useful without becoming the mystery itself. The experiment might also reveal multiple forms of transformation. One practitioner may show profound absorption, but modest interpersonal change. Another may display unusual compassion without dramatic altered states. A third may gain emotional stability while retaining strong self-narrative. The data could challenge the assumption that awakening is one uniform event. The required timescale is the final surprise. The study capable of approaching enlightenment may not be one scan or one retreat. It may require years of observing how a human being responds as life removes comfort, adds responsibility, and changes the body. The laboratory can become more rigorous, but it cannot remove the final personal question. Why does the mind seek liberation at all? And what would freedom look like after the machines are turned off? To answer, the story must return to the practitioner who first entered the scanner. Morning has reached the city by the time the practitioner leaves the laboratory. The scanner is silent. Researchers remain inside with files, images, and unanswered questions. Outside, buses move through traffic, vendors raise shutters, and impatient voices gather at crossings. The world offers no protected state. The practitioner walks among ordinary desires. A screen advertises something new. A driver pushes forward. A stranger speaks sharply into a phone. The body responds to each event with tiny predictions, preferences, and defensive movements. Nothing about the street resembles the stillness of absorption. There is no guarantee that the practitioner feels peaceful at the crossing. Training does not prevent fatigue, grief, or the body's alarm. The difference, if one exists, may be the absence of a second struggle against having the first experience. Sadness can remain without becoming evidence of failure. Fear can remain without becoming a complete identity. This quiet possibility is less dramatic than a secret circuit. It cannot be displayed in a thumbnail as easily as a glowing brain. Yet it may be closer to what the old teachings guarded. Not a supernatural escape, but a change in the ownership and continuation of suffering itself, from one moment into the next. No glowing brain image follows him. What remains is the next response. Neuroscience may eventually explain how attention stabilizes, how reward can arise without possession, why self-boundaries weaken, and which forms of network coordination support equanimity. It may improve treatment for suffering and reveal capacities hidden inside ordinary consciousness. These achievements would be profound, yet liberation cannot be reduced to the rarest state a person can produce. A state begins and ends. Life continues through illness, aging, uncertainty, loss, and relationship. The deeper evidence may be what fails to take control when conditions become difficult. An insult appears but does not become a night of hatred. Desire appears but does not define what must happen next. Fear appears but does not close every possible action. Pain remains pain without the added demand that reality be different before peace is allowed. This is not passivity. Person can resist injustice without hatred, protect boundaries without building an enemy, and seek change without believing that happiness depends on controlling every result. Freedom would not erase preference. It would loosen the compulsion hidden inside preference. The neural path may therefore be a loop rather than a road. Sensation appears. The brain predicts. Pleasant or unpleasant value is assigned. Craving or resistance begins. The self-story gathers around the reaction. Awareness recognizes the sequence, and another response becomes possible. At first, recognition arrives late. The words have already been spoken. The action has already begun. With training, the sequence becomes visible earlier. A bodily tightening is noticed before anger becomes certainty. Longing is felt before it becomes pursuit. The loop does not vanish, but its ending is no longer predetermined. Ancient traditions describe this in moral and contemplative language. Neuroscience describes attention, prediction, salience, reward, regulation, and plasticity. The languages do not perfectly translate, yet both approach the same human moment, the interval in which reaction can become choice. Perhaps that interval is too small to deserve the word nirvana. Traditional liberation makes a far greater claim. But every path toward freedom must pass through the places where bondage is renewed. The ordinary loop is where suffering keeps receiving fresh life. The practitioner reaches a crossing and waits. Nothing visible marks him as different. The mystery has returned to its smallest scale, one mind meeting one moment, without demanding that the moment confirm its identity. Perhaps enlightenment is not the brain escaping the human condition. Perhaps it is the ending of the demand that the human condition becomes something else before it can be met clearly. The scanner offers maps. Traditions offer instructions. Experience offers no final commentary. It simply continues. Sound, sensation, memory, breath, and the quiet possibility that none must become a prison. The light changes. The practitioner crosses with everyone else. Behind him, the laboratory holds images of a brain moving through states that once belonged only to hidden rooms and whispered teachings. Ahead lies the only place where their meaning can be tested, a changing world that refuses to remain still.